in America doing research on education policy. That's kind of strange because he's Canadian. Julian is a professor of economics at the University of California, San Diego. He's also a research associate at the National Bureau for Economic Research and an adjunct fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. Julian has an extensive portfolio of influential research in the areas of teacher effectiveness, school choice, and the economic returns to education. My favorite book of his that I inflict on all my students is Getting Choice Right, co-edited with Tom Lovelace. And Julian and I both served on the National Working Commission on Choice in K-12 Education back way back, like 8 years ago. What's that?
Co-authored with Bob.
So Julian co-authored work with Bob Castrell, so he doesn't always exercise good judgment. but he's always a very interesting and engaging speaker, and so I give you Julian Betts.
Thank you very much for that very nice introduction, Patrick. It's great to be here. I'm just delighted at the invitation. So our next speaker is going to be Richard Aram, Professor of Sociology and Education at NYU. You've got to go to that one. He's great. What I'm going to talk to you about today is teacher merit pay based on what we call value-added models of student achievement. And the subtitle here is, it a brilliant innovation or near certain disaster? This is something the U.S. Department of Education has really started to push very hard. And the question is this a sensible thing to do or not? I don't know how many of you have read this, but a couple of weeks ago, the Economic Policy Institute put out with great fanfare this briefing, Problems with the Use of Student Test Scores to Evaluate Teachers, with a list of authors, a sort of a who's who: Eva Baker, director of CREST; Linda Darling-Hammond, who you all know; Ed Hartel, who's a top psychometrician at Stanford; someone named Diane Ravitch, I'm sure some of you have heard of, and so on. So I prepared this talk before I saw this briefing paper. There's actually a fair amount of common ground between this paper, which is this briefing paper. It comes down very hard against the idea of performance pay based on student test scores, and what I'm going to say. But I think I'm a lot more optimistic than what this set of authors has to say. And I'll give you some of the reasons for that as we go along. So let me get started here. I'm going to start by telling you a little bit that you probably already know in an audience like this about how teachers are currently paid in most U.S. districts and some of the problems with that. Talk about some of the theoretical advantages of teacher merit pay, and then get into the really thorny questions. How do you actually measure teachers' merit or contribution to school effectiveness? And then I'm going to spend most of my time on is basically assessing frankly, it's a litany of complaints about things that can go wrong with merit pay programs. I'm going to go through what I think are the half dozen most serious complaints. Preview of what I'm going to say here is that the current form of teacher compensation really makes little sense at all. Merit pay could help, but there are a lot of things you need to watch out for along the way. And I think that most of the problems can be dealt with. There's one problem that worries me tremendously, and we'll get to that towards the end of the talk. Okay, so how are teachers paid currently? Mike Podgorski has this very good paper establishing that in 97% of public school districts in this country, teachers are paid based on pre-established pay schedules, and those pay schedules typically give people raises, teachers raises, depending on years of experience in the district, whether they have a master's, authorizations, credentials, things like that. And that seems like a reasonable way to proceed until you look at the research literature, which shows time and time again that credentials and whether a teacher has a master's degree, years of experience, all those things put together don't really account for much of the actual variations between one teacher and another in effectiveness. So just one example, Corey Codell, who's at the University of Missouri, and I did a paper looking at San Diego Unified data, and we actually did one of these value-added models to figure out who the best teachers were in the district. We then took those estimates and tried to explain them in terms of a very rich data set, incorporating experience, credentials, subject authorizations, and the like. And at the very most, we could explain about 7% of the true variation in teaching effectiveness with all these things to factor into teacher pay. So teachers in San Diego are being paid for things that really don't contribute to teaching effectiveness. Now there's you need to be careful here. The measure of teaching effectiveness is individual student gains on the state tests in reading and math. So some of you may take issue with that and say, well, there are other things that teachers do that go way beyond that. And I think that's a good comment. But I think, if most policymakers really took this number to heart, it would give them pause about the way we pay teachers. So what's the problem with paying teachers, apart from pay hikes for experience, more or less a flat salary? Well, if you do that, and there's a distribution of worker ability out there, and so some teachers are better than others, and this may or may not be right, but suppose that the things that make teachers better also would make them more productive in the private sector. Well, the private sector typically doesn't have collective bargaining agreements and so on, which tends to flatten pay schedules. They're going to pay people according to productivity. People get promoted up to their level of incompetence, right? That's the great American way. I'm department chair, living proof. So, now, what happens in a world like this if a bright young woman can go into teaching, wants to be a high school science teacher, or could go into the industry as, say, a computer science type? Well, the pay is going to be higher if you're really able in the private sector. So what's going to happen is that in a system like this, the only people who are going to self-select into teaching are the people who are going to do better in that sector, and that's going to be people at this end of the ability distribution. Now, this is a simplistic depiction. Psychologists and economists agree that there isn't such a thing as ability. It's actually a vector. There are all sorts of different, you've heard of multiple intelligences and so on. But it's likely the case that the things that make people more productive as teachers also would make them more productive in the private sector. So why not have a system of merit pay so that you could get some of these people wanting to stay in teaching? So the two advantages, at least as I see it, of setting teacher pay in line with their true effectiveness is first the argument I've just made, that you can get the best people into teaching to start with. There's also an argument to be made that pay for performance in some form actually could induce extra effort among employees in any organization. And why should it be any different for teachers? This EPI briefing paper, which has about 10 authors but not a single economist, on page 1 of the executive summary says, there is little or no evidence for the claim that teachers will be more motivated to improve student learning if teachers are evaluated or monetarily rewarded for student test score gains. If you just broaden that question a little bit, I don't think that's right. Dale Ballou has a very nice paper from 2007 looking at teaching effectiveness in various forms of compensation, and he makes a fairly strong argument that teachers aren't different from workers in other occupations. If you pay people more for better outcomes, they will work harder. So to put this in the sort of gobbledygook that we economists like to use, merit pay solves an adverse selection problem. What that means is that you can get better people into the profession if you pay for performance. And it also solves a moral hazard problem in the sense that in any industry, workers' effort is never perfectly observable by managers. And you want to come up with incentives to get around that. So using things like in the context of teachers, looking at students' test scores might be a way of inducing more effort. This whole issue of merit pay for teachers based on student test scores has gained a lot of currency in the last little while because of our current U.S. Secretary of Education in the recent race to the top, competitive bids across states. States were strongly incentivized to pass laws to make it possible for districts to make a substantial chunk of teacher pay contingent upon student performance. And I think a lot of people view that as quite revolutionary. So what do we actually know about this? So the first thing I'm going to talk about is, well, how do we actually measure teaching effectiveness, which is a very tricky question. And I'm going to, because of lack of time, give a fairly superficial answer to it, but I think still somewhat helpful. I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the second issue, which is, what are the problems with teacher merit pay based on student test scores? Okay, so let's start with this whole idea of merit. Some very influential players in the education policy world argue that we already have great ways of evaluating teachers for effectiveness. So Linda Darling-Hammond, for example, is, among other things, a very strong proponent of advanced teaching credentials, such as National Board for Professional Teaching Standards. I was part of a National Academy of Science committee that was asked by Congress to evaluate these standards. And our conclusion was that teachers who go through all the work, putting together teaching portfolios, including videos, taking subject matter tests, actually pass this test, are slightly better than teachers who don't have these certifications. But the process of going through this, which is quite involved, doesn't seem to make you a better teacher. And in fact, there's some evidence that Dan Goldhaber produced in North Carolina that the process of going through this, it can be a year or longer, actually lowers your teaching effectiveness temporarily. So there's small gains, at least in terms of labeling teachers. But it's not necessarily making teachers better. So if we can't use advanced credentials, what about basic teaching credentials? Well, I've already told you, I gave you one example that Corey and I have done in San Diego that's mirrored by lots of studies elsewhere, that teacher experience credentials, subject authorizations in general, are not very good explainers, explanatory factors for actual variations in teaching effectiveness. So it sort of seems like we don't really know where to look. So how could we do a better job? Well, why not looking at test scores? And this has become possible over the last 10 to 15 years, depends on the state. Most states have implemented testing procedures where students are tested annually, at least in certain grades. In California, we sort of go beyond the grade 3 to 8 range. We test from grades 2 to 11. So why not look at the question of how much does a student learn in a given year? So compare test scores this spring with last spring and use that as a rough gauge of how effective the teacher was. So you can compare teachers across grades. One example would be, grade 3 teacher has 30 students, and they later subdivide, 10 go to teacher A in grade 4, 10 go to teacher B, and 10 go to teacher C. Then you can compare the grade 4 teachers to each other, in theory, pretty simply. Well, what are some problems with that? I'm going to go through, this is going to be much broader than just my little narrow contribution to this literature. I'm going to talk fairly broadly, but what I see is some of the main criticisms of teacher merit pay based on student test scores. And it aligns fairly well with some of the things said in here, although I don't claim in this talk, and I never say that teachers are never motivated by compensation. I think that's a strange comment to make, as the EPI briefing paper did. So let's start with criticism number one. I think this is a valid one. Under NCLB, states are required to test in math and ELA and one other subject in certain grades. So there are a whole bunch of subjects that are untested. What do you actually do about those? I think you just have to have a pragmatic solution to that. Take the test scores where you have them available. You can have teachers develop their own metrics for social studies and so on. So you can do tests within school or within district and try to come up with something similar for other subjects. Another thing you can do is to rely upon principal observation. Dick Bren has this wonderful book published way back in 1975 where he went into certain schools and he asked principals at the start of the year to identify the best teachers. He then did a pre-test on students and an end-of-the-year post-test And the principals actually had quite accurate sense of who the best teachers were. So if you can't use just test scores, then you can use principal observations. Now, if I've gone that far, then the next thing you might say is, well, then why use test scores at all? Why not just use principal evaluations? And for that, I would refer you to the book called Who Will Teach by Dick Murnane and a bunch of co-authors that came out maybe 10, 12 years ago. There's this wonderful chapter on the history of merit pay, and he argues pretty effectively that any serious merit pay program, by which I mean one where the salary is going to the underperformers versus the top performers, are substantially different, they never survive more than a few years. And there's a backlash from teachers when the principals can't explain why, Patrick got the raise and I didn't. And so pressure builds and these things just sort of melt away. What's useful about test scores is that it's something that's graded externally, it's objective, and all teachers are held to the same content standards. So you don't want to just throw them out the window, I don't think. Criticism number 2 is that this whole idea of linking math test score gains to the math teacher, say in high school, is illegitimate because there are other teachers teaching as well, and really teaching, to a large extent, is a group activity. So what about that? Well, there's a very good theoretical piece on this by Holmstrom in 1982 in an economic journal. He refers to this as team production. And the problem with team production is that if there are 10 people contributing to a common goal, how do you develop incentive systems in a situation like that? You could say, well, if production as firm goes up, we'll divide the gain equally among the 10 of you workers. Well, why would I then work a lot harder because I'm only going to get 1/10 of the fruit of my efforts? So this is known as the team production problem. It's also known as sort of the free rider problem. So it makes it hard to argue that we should just do pay performance at a school level only. On the other hand, though, there's later work following up on Holmstrom that says that if you have small groups where workers can in some way monitor each other, the free rider problem really goes down. Because if we're all working together towards a common goal, and you see that I'm goofing off, you're going to say something about it because you've got something at stake here. So what do we actually know about this? Corey Cudell, a former student of mine, as part of his thesis, looked at the idea of spillovers among high school teachers in San Diego schools. And this is now, I believe, published. And what he found was that there are spillovers. So, science teachers are associated with math test score gains. So if you see really great performance for your son at a high school, it might be the math teacher. It's probably mainly the math teacher, but there are other teachers probably contributing to that as well. His judgment was the spillovers were actually pretty small, so that at least to some extent you could retain, even in the high school context, the idea of compensating math teachers for improvement in math scores. But there is something there. So you can imagine a system where merit pay is both teacher-based and school-based. And that might be a very nice way of partially solving this problem. Criticism number 3 is just a really fun one. In any organization, when you set up incentives, people are really smart, and they're going to find ways to game the system. So economists love this stuff, so of course they tried to find all sorts of ways that people, not necessarily cheating, but are trying to do this. So Brian Jacob has documented what educators have said from the outset, which is that NCLB is going to sort of divert attention away from non-tested subjects. So he's documented that for one sample. He's also found that schools are now incentivized in some accountability systems to designate kids as special education and try to get them exempted from the state test. Another common thing that he found was that in some cases schools would hold kids back a grade thinking that, well, if they're tested in grade 3 again next year, they're going to hurt our school less than if we promote them to grade 4. David Figlio has done work suggesting that principals are much more likely to suspend or expel students right around test season, and it's low-scoring students who get expelled. And then paper that makes me laugh every time I think about it, he has former student Josh Winicki who went to work for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and they're trying to think, well, how can we keep working together on education stuff? And they came up with the idea of school lunches. So they got this wonderful data on actual school lunches served, and they found that there were some school districts that found a great way of gaming the system on state tests. They give much better lunches during testing season, and not only that, but the two of them documented that better lunches lead to better test scores that afternoon. So sort of caloric cheating. It's really, I don't know that it's really caloric cheating, but this is the biggie. Jacob and Lovett went in Chicago schools and got individual results for students, and found a pattern that in certain classrooms a whole block of students would be answering a whole bunch of questions exactly the same way, and guess what? All those multiple choice answers happened to be correct. And then even more surprising was often the most difficult questions that were all answered correctly by 2/3 of the class. So here's an example from their paper. This is a real issue. What do we do about it? Well, I don't know about on this campus. We have rampant problems with undergraduate cheating at UCSD. Is the answer that we're never going to have exams again for undergraduates? No. This is a little bit different, to be fair, because this is saying, you know, your student's performance is going to affect your pay, and so obviously creates an incentive for cheating. I guess the other thing I haven't said about this paper, I'm assuming a lot of you have already seen this or read about it in Steve Levitt's book, Freakonomics, but they got permission from the superintendent to actually look at the paper files where students had answered, and they really verified in some cases this clearly was cheating after the fact, because they could find eraser marks right around these blocks. So, pretty interesting. My take on this is that, well, Jacob and Levitt have done this work. We now have reasonably sophisticated ways of detecting cheating. So that's something we need to take advantage of. Okay, criticism number 4 is that, you know what, there's ability grouping and there's tracking in most American schools. Students are not assigned randomly to teachers, so this seems extraordinarily unfair to teachers. So, you know, typically what we find is that less experienced teachers get lower performing students. They may get a slightly smaller class size, but they get lower performing students. That could cut either way, actually. You think that what that means is that their students will show smaller gains, but I've worked with some data sets where low performing students actually have bigger gains. It's partly a function of, you know, if you're using vertically scaled tests, whether the vertical scaling is really done properly or not. So this is a legitimate concern. We don't want to reward some teachers unjustly just because of the students they were assigned, and punish other teachers for the same reason they're getting different type of students. So I want some evidence on this. I think the most compelling evidence is work by Jesse Rothstein, which has just come out in the last couple of years in Education, Finance, and Policy, now the QJE. He's now at Berkeley. He uses statewide data from North Carolina, and he came up with sort of an ingenious way of showing that ability grouping really is out there, and you can come up with some funny results by asking the following question. Let's look at students' test score gains in grade 4 and see whether grade 5 teachers, in other words, the teacher the kid is going to have next year, can actually predict what happens in grade 4. And he finds that even after controlling for who the grade 4 teacher was, the grade 5 teacher, the future teacher, can predict current test score gains. So his interpretation of that is that there's ability grouping going on. You can't really make the claim that future teachers cause current test score gains. So we're going to pay grade 4 teachers for the grade 4 gains. Why not pay the grade 5 teachers? And wait a minute, that makes no sense at all, because they can't have contributed to it. So his interpretation is that merit pay, at least merit pay based on student test score gains, is really highly dubious because of this non-random sorting of or assignment of students to teachers. This is played up very heavily in this EPI report that I held up at the beginning. So Corey Codell and I were interested in this, and we started out just asking, well, North Carolina is one state, and one state can produce different results from another. Look at the charter school literature. The strongest evidence of underperforming charter schools comes from North Carolina. Maybe it's something about the test, maybe it's something about other characteristics of the state. So we tried to reproduce Jesse's results in San Diego Unified, which is the second largest district in California, and we could do it. We found that indeed, grade 5 teachers are predictive of grade 4 student gains even after we control for who the grade 4 teacher is. It's hard to believe that's causal unless teachers are working in teams all the time. And we have the same interpretation that Jesse does, that there's transitory sorting bias. So for example, what might happen is that a student has trouble at home one year and falls behind in the class he's been assigned to, so next year it gets assigned to a lower performing class and actually might do better. So there's sort of regression to the mean. And we think the transitory sorting bias is an issue here because we put in student fixed effects. We're not comparing one student to another. We're comparing one student to himself and looking for changes in trajectory. So basically, well, I'm sort of forecasting the solution we found to this, but let me just go forward and show you the problem first. What we're showing here is the p-values for all tests that all grade 4 teachers are identical in terms of test score gains for their students. You reject that at less than 1% level. And over here we've got the raw standard deviation across teachers and our estimates of their effectiveness. And this is adjusted. And basically what we've done here is adjusted by taking the raw variance and subtracting the average of the squares of the standard errors. So in other words, part of the variance that you see over here is just because we can't estimate these things very precisely. We do the same thing for grade 5 teachers. For them, we attest that all grade, doesn't matter who your grade 5 teacher is next year, it doesn't affect your outcome. We reject that at less than the 1% level as well. And the variance in sort of fake teaching effectiveness of grade 5 teachers is pretty big. It's about almost 2/3 the size of the variance that we think is probably real. So when we started this, we thought, Jesse's got this nailed, and this is almost like the nail in the coffin of teacher merit pay based on value-added models. What we found, though, is a solution. We realized that what Jesse did was to follow a single cohort of students from, I think it was grades 3 through grade 5. Now, why would you ever establish a teacher merit pay system where you ignored all the other classes a teacher had taught and just said, we're going to look at the kids born in 1998, and those are the only kids we're going to use in figuring out whether you're an effective teacher? You wouldn't do that. You would use all the classes that a teacher had ever taught, presumably. So we found that including 4 years of student data per teacher, which reduces to 3 gains, because you need one teacher to sort of be the base, reduces this problem to statistical insignificance. What I mean by that is going back here, when you do this test that all grade 5 teachers are equal, the p-value rises to about 0.25. And it actually turns out to be crucial that you use 4 years of data. We tried removing one cohort of students at a time, and if you use 3 years of student data, the problem that Jesse uncovered still persists. You use 4 years of data, the problem is solved. I should be careful here. You need not only 4 years of student data, but you need to use student fixed effects, which subtracts the mean of a student's test scores from his whole trajectory. And by doing that, you're no longer comparing, Patrick to Julian. You're just comparing me to my experience in grades 2, 3, 4, and 5. When you do that, and you use 4 years worth of classes for each teacher, this transitory sorting bias seems to go away. So I think we might have a solution to this one. But it's really important to say that this is not a carte blanche solution. There are a lot of people in DC right now, and a lot of economists, who are arguing that we should use value-added models of teaching effectiveness to identify the worst teachers, especially in the first 2 years of teaching, because in most states, teachers get tenure after roughly 2 or 3 years. Corey and I are really skeptical about this because we're basically showing that future teachers